Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Ethan Katz, and I teach in the Center for Jewish Studies and the Department of History here at UC Berkeley. And it is my pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague, Robin Buller, for the talk she'll be giving this afternoon. Welcome to all of you who are watching. Robin is currently a postdoctoral fellow in the history of migration at the German Historical Institute West here on the UC Berkeley campus. So we're lucky to have her right here. Robin received her PhD from UNC Chapel Hill in 2021 in history with a dissertation entitled Ottoman Jews in Paris, Sephardi Immigrant Community, Culture, and Identity, 1918 to 1939. Before that, she received her BA at the University of Toronto. She's been quite prolific as a young scholar. She has published in Yad Vashem Studies, an article on Salonican Jews in Auschwitz, and she has a forthcoming article in Jewish Social Studies on the memorialization of First World War Ottoman Jewish volunteer soldiers and the construction of interwar identity. She is currently revising her dissertation into a book which has a wonderful working title, A Millet on the Seine, Ottoman Jewish Immigrants in Interwar and Occupied Paris. I just want to say a personal word because Robin and I first met in the archives in Paris.
In the elevator.
In the elevator. Robin was there. I believe she was really fresh off the boat. Like she had just arrived in Paris to really dig into her dissertation research. I was there just for a few days doing research for my current book. So it was really quite serendipitous that we met, but I was excited to learn about her project then, and it's been a real pleasure to get to know her more and to watch her research and her career develop and blossom in the time since then. So it's great that we get to be colleagues here in Berkeley and that we can welcome her for this talk. Her talk today is entitled Ottomans After Empire, Sephardi Immigrant Space and Daily Life in Interwar Paris. So welcome to Robin, and really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Ethan. That was very kind of you to say, and obviously I feel the same way, that I'm very lucky to know you and have had you as a mentor since that day in the archives at the Center for Jewish Documentation in Paris. What a interesting way to have met. And thank you to the Center for Jewish Studies for having me today. I wish we could be meeting in person. I've only ever really given a talk to, let's say, nine or maximum 10 people at an AJS conference. So this would have been fun, but I'm still very grateful to be able to have all of you here on this platform. And as Ethan mentioned, my talk today is based on a chapter for the book that I'm working on that's coming out of my dissertation. And so it's a work in progress. So any questions, suggestions, sort of ideas for framing that you may have are very welcome. And I look forward to hearing your comments shortly. All right, so I will share my screen and we can get started. All right. Hopefully you can see it. Perhaps the best way to do this is if anyone can't see it, let me know, and we'll get started. So in the first decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of Jews migrated out of the crumbling Ottoman Empire and its post-Ottoman successor states in the southeastern Mediterranean to France, where the vast majority settled in the Roquette Quarter of Paris's 11th Arrondissement. This is a space of just over 1 square kilometer surrounding the bustling intersection where Boulevard Voltaire, Rue Sedan, and Rue de la Roquette meet. With its streets lined with Ottoman Jewish restaurants, butchers, spice dealers, textile shops, its apartment buildings inhabited by Ottoman Jewish families, and a center marked by the Ottoman Jewish Immigrant Synagogue, the Popincourt Temple, the quarter quickly gained the moniker of Little Turkey, suggesting that through this immigrant group, a foreign way of life had been transposed directly onto the French capital. Joseph Cohen, whose parents arrived in Paris from Istanbul in 1923 and rented an apartment on Little Turkey's main drag, remembered the sense of community well into his old age. Quote, Voltaire was like a little island for me, he recounted in 2012, a paradise. He expressed that the Roquette Quarter was where he met the, quote, Ben Davids, the Ben Shoams, the Razons, the Ojalvos, the Toledos, the Francos. Cohen continued, referencing a number of Sephardi names of other families who lived nearby, and how he and his parents would frequent the quarter's Oriental, as he called them, cafes and spice shops. Quote, I still have the aromas in my nose, he mused. In today's talk, which as I said is a snippet of my larger book project on Ottoman Sephardi immigrants in interwar and wartime France, I'll explain how this Jewish migrant group navigated immigrant belonging in the French capital in the first decades of the 20th century. I'll show that Ottoman Sephardim made a clear mark on the map of interwar Paris, carved out distinct communal spaces that reflected their immigrant identity and that redefined what it meant to be and to belong as a Jewish immigrant in the French capital by bringing their Ottoman and Sephardi roots into their new Parisian surroundings. For Ottoman Sephardim, communal spaces entrenched the community in Paris's physical geography, but they were also rooted in traditions and characteristics that originated in Jewish life in the Ottoman lands. So these spaces transported Ottoman Sephardi immigrants back to daily life in Istanbul or Salonika in many ways, but they also enabled them to, settle into their new city and to succeed, whatever that meant, as Parisian immigrants. So through these spaces, Ottoman Sephardi immigrants were bound to a community through which they, found social support and friendship, secured housing and work opportunities, preserved customs and traditions, and at times encountered internal tensions and divisions. But taken together, these spaces gave Ottomanness, the sort of clunky term that I like to use, continued life and meaning even after the empire's demise. So the descendants of Jews expelled from the Iberian Peninsula in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Sephardi Jews had formed a sizable ethnic minority in the Ottoman Empire, where they retained many Spanish cultural tendencies, especially the use of the Judeo-Spanish language, Ladino. In the early 20th century, they migrated to France and elsewhere in the world, in Western Europe and the Americas, in large numbers. From cities in the countries that would go on to become Greece and Turkey, namely the cities that I have circled in red here of Salonika, Edirne, Istanbul, and Izmir, as well as some smaller cities in the region. Numbering around 8,000 individuals in 1914, their numbers in Paris would grow to 35,000 by the outbreak of World War II in 1939, with the total number of Ottoman Jews and their children in the entire country of France at the time being closer to 50,000. The community's rapid expansion was felt by native French Jews and immigrant Jews alike. In 1921, the Parisian journal L'Univers Israélite pointed to what they called a, quote, Jewish agglomeration formed by descendants of former immigrants from Spain, these co-religionists from Constantinople, Salonika, Smyrna, and Adrianople. A decade later, the high number of Ottoman Jews in the city was still considered remarkable, with another journalist commenting on the, quote, imposing numbers of Jewish immigrants from the Levant. And it's really compelling that the Ottoman Sephardi immigrant community was so noticeable as an entity, because in the first decades of the 20th century, hundreds of thousands of immigrants of all stripes and backgrounds resettled in France, including around 150,000 Ashkenazi Jews coming from Eastern and Central Europe. And it's these Jewish immigrants who have really captured the bulk of historians' attention and who dominate the literature on Jewish migration to France during this period, with an important exception, of course, being Professor Katz's own research on North African Jewish and Muslim migration to the metropole. So historians have shown that Ashkenazi immigrants were often looked upon sort of unfavorably by France's native Jewish population, who saw their conspicuous cultural differences, things like use of the Yiddish language, conservative traditional dress, as well as the perception that Eastern European Jews harbored some kind of radical left-wing politics. French Jews saw these things as potential threats to Jewish acceptance and stability in France, a country whose migration policies really emphasized cultural homogeneity as a precursor to national belonging. And during the Holocaust, these immigrant Jews were also persecuted at far higher rates than were France's native Jews, an indication of how xenophobia and anti-Semitism became increasingly intertwined in the late Third Republic. But by focusing on Eastern European Jewish newcomers, historians have created a narrative of Jewish immigrant otherness in interwar and wartime France that doesn't reflect the diversity and texture of France's multiple Jewish immigrant groups during this period. In some ways, the Ottoman Jewish migration experience was similar to that of other groups. They were pushed out of their homelands for reasons we hear about all the time. War, most notably the Balkan Wars and the First World War, nationalism in both Greece, or what became Greece, and Turkey, the construction of new borders after these conflicts, forced migrations, especially the Greco-Turkish population exchange, as well as economic struggles that came with living as a minority in regions ravaged by conflict and imperial collapse. And like other contemporaneous immigrants, Ottoman Jews were drawn to France by the country's liberal immigration policies, by economic opportunities, especially after the human toll taken by World War I, and an idealized image of France not only as sort of the land of liberty and equality and fraternity, but also as the harbinger of Jewish liberty specifically, as France had been, the first European nation to emancipate its Jews after the French Revolution. So they shared a confidence with their fellow Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants that France would be sort of a Jewish safe haven. But unlike other Jewish migrants arriving in France during this period, Ottoman Sephardim were drawn to France by a shared cultural kinship. In fact, most Ottoman Jews arrived in France fluent in the French language. This was the result of the activities of various Franco-Jewish educational organizations around the Mediterranean basin, but most especially those of the Alliance Israélite Universelle. This was a Paris-based Jewish organization that sought the, quote, regeneration, that's their term, of Eastern Sephardi Jews through a French-styled education. So through the Alliance, France's colonial mission civilisatrice, this civilizing mission, was exported to regions beyond its formal empire, to places like the Ottoman lands. Thus, upon arrival in France in the interwar years, most Ottoman Jewish immigrants were intimately familiar with French culture and language, and thereby had access to relationships and opportunities that were closed to non-French speakers. And despite this, Ottoman Sephardim, I've found, didn't just seamlessly assimilate into French life, nor did they blend into the much more sizable Ashkenazi immigrant communities in Paris and other cities. Rather, Ottoman Sephardi immigrants remained culturally distinct, transforming Paris's physical landscape and the neighborhoods in which they lived into Ottoman spaces. And nowhere was this more noticeable than in the Roquette Quarter of the 11th Arrondissement. And I've highlighted the Roquette Quarter in purple on this map. So for immigrants like Maurice Véron, whose family arrived from Turkey in 1921, Paris's 11th Arrondissement immediately felt like home. The Roquette Quarter, he explained in a 2012 interview, was, quote, just like a typical Judeo-Spanish village, with cafes on every corner. And indeed, cafes were a defining feature of immigrant life in the 11th Arrondissement. However, unlike the cafes of the Arab lands or of Eastern Europe, which we've heard about a lot and which were sort of spaces of philosophical debate and dialogue and anonymity, the Ottoman Jewish cafes of Paris's 11th Arrondissement served really tangible, practical purposes. They were nitty-gritty, spaces of Jewish labor and entrepreneurship, in which jobs were acquired and business deals were made, spaces of cultural preservation where Levantine food and drink were served, and spaces of socialization where marriages and mitzvahs were celebrated over rounds of raki, the preferred Turkish spirit. And one cafe, Le Bosphore, which I have a photo that I believe is from the 1970s up here on the left of the slide, it became sort of the literal and figurative center of interwar Ottoman Jewish life. Its name, meaning the Bosphorus, echoed the owner's Istanbul roots, while also suggesting a meeting of two worlds, East and West, French and foreign. And more than just a watering hole, it was a space in which Ottoman Jewish practices were perpetuated, migrant knowledge was shared, and kinship networks were nourished. It wasn't uncommon for Ottoman Jewish immigrants to learn of Le Bosphore prior to even arriving in France. It was commonly the first stop for newcomers who had heard rumors of the cafe or who had seen advertisements for it in the Ottoman Ladino or Ottoman French Jewish press. And for them, the cafe was, a space of initial welcome, offering Sephardi immigrants a first glimpse of the community to which they were offered automatic belonging. And it extended to them the opportunity to gain knowledge from the broader migrant network that would help them survive in the bustling city. And on the right here, we see the interior, not of Le Bosphore, but of another cafe called L'Istanbul. And below, it's the Mizrahi Frères, the sort of brothers cafe, another cafe, showing that there were a number of these cafes and restaurants that were community centers in the interwar period. At Le Bosphore, Ottoman Jewish immigrants learned from fellow migrants where to find initial lodging in the quarter, often a room in one of several furnished hotels located near the cafe. The Hotel de l'Europe, which was immediately above Le Bosphore, was a common first address. And here we have a residence permit, and it says, as this individual, Vitali Balur's residence, Hotel de l'Europe, 74 Rue Sedan, the address of Le Bosphore. Offering minimal but affordable accommodations, furnished hotels became themselves really important sites in the Ottoman Sephardi map of Paris as spaces that offered not only a bed and a roof over one's head, but also access to surrounding communal networks. They were really in the middle of where things were happening for this community. And Le Bosphore also served as a space for immigrants to secure employment opportunities, usually from fellow Ottoman Jews. So for the majority of these immigrants who were poor and unskilled, this meant working as laborers or as merchants. And after meeting at the cafe, new arrivals would be, taken under the wing of a more settled Ottoman Sephardi immigrant who showed them how to work as street vendors, following the local market schedules, peddling wares, most often, textiles acquired from neighborhood wholesalers who were typically themselves Ottoman Jews, although a little bit more well-off socioeconomically, a little bit more bourgeois. And in the photo on the right here, we see Jacques Cohen, who is selling textiles at the market at La Courneuve. And you can see he is holding a jacket out to potential buyers. So for immigrants who had not yet acquired work permits, like Eliezer Eskenazi of Salonika, connections made at the cafe enabled him to find regular employment under the table as a tailor for, as he put it, members of the community. For Joseph Toro, who was originally from Istanbul, it was at the cafe and not at a brick and mortar wholesale shop where he negotiated the prices on bulk items that he later sold at markets. It really became his office. And in post-war testimonies, his son Jacques explained that, quote, the merchandise could be anything, fabric, whatever happened to be at Le Bosphore. The cafe thus became not only sort of a space of communal gathering, but also the site of a new microeconomy, wherein belonging to the community gave Ottoman Jewish immigrants access to labor, to employment, to business prospects, as well as to goods and services. Le Bosphore and other establishments served as these sites of cultural preservation in which food, and leisure were sort of preserved in the form of borekas, raki, playing card games that had been habitual parts of Jewish life in Ottoman lands. But they also preserved the inherent diversity of Ottoman Sephardi traditions and identities, and underscored how immigrants from disparate cities or regions saw themselves as distinct parts of an ethnocultural whole. Many cafes, for instance, were tailored to specific regional or local subgroups. Sephardim from Turkey would go to one cafe, usually Chez Sotil or Chez Motola. Bulgarian Sephardim would go to Chez Buko, and Sephardim from Turkey would go to L'Istanbul. But everyone was ostensibly welcome at Le Bosphore, again, this meeting place. And Ottoman Sephardim, as this shows, were not a monolithic entity. Rather, they had cultural, linguistic, political variances while living in the Ottoman lands that they then carried across the Mediterranean into their adoptive French homeland. Sami Dassa, another immigrant who was interviewed in the post-war period, remembers that, quote, everyone knew who was Turkish and who was Greek, underscoring the layers that existed within this community's broader Ottoman Sephardi sense of belonging. The persistence of Ottoman customs and relationships was both a source of connection and a source of division. Ottoman Jewish immigrants were eager to hire and work for one another. In naturalization files, most working newcomers, for instance, cited a fellow Ottoman Jewish immigrant as their employer. Frequently, also proprietors underscored their heritage in business names and promotions and advertisements in an effort to secure patronage from fellow Ottoman Jews, a practice that further entrenched their reliance on this imported but also very insular kinship economy. So a promotion for one furniture company read in this advertisement that I have on the slide above, careful, do not buy a single piece of furniture before seeing Mala of Salonika, emphasizing the owner's Balkan roots and sort of insinuating that they are more trustworthy because they are a member of the community themselves. But the persistent emphasis on these Ottoman ties and Ottoman roots exhibited by the working class immigrants in the 11th arrondissement weren't always well received by others. So contrary to Ottoman Jewish immigrants' expectations that based on their appreciation for Frenchness and their upbringing in French schools, France's native Jews would, unquestioningly welcome them as members of the fold. Native French Jews were at times hesitant to accept Ottoman Jewish immigrants' claims to belonging. French Jewish leaders were particularly critical of what they saw as backward or foreign practices from the Ottoman lands being carried out in the 11th arrondissement. Unusual and purportedly unkosher butchering practices, for instance, as well as the tradition of conducting weddings in private homes rather than in synagogues. And we see a photo depicting a wedding from 1923 in the slide here. So the French Jewish establishment really feared that these activities might damage the reputation of France's more integrated Jews as being, inconspicuous and assimilable, and as keeping religion in the private sphere and Frenchness in the public sphere. And in fact, their disdain for these elements of Ottoman Jewish foreignness led the more upper class, the better off Ottoman Jews to migrate out of the working class 11th arrondissement and form sort of a new immigrant community in the 9th arrondissement. As the interwar years progressed, cafes in the Roquette Quarter often played host to budding communal associations. The Sephardi Zionist Association of Paris, for instance, met monthly at Le Bosphore, an association for Ottoman Sephardi veterans who fought for France in the First World War, named the Café de la Mairie just around the corner from Le Bosphore as the seat of their organization. And La Fraternité, an Ottoman Jewish youth group whose periodical I have featured on this slide, they used Chez Albert as their headquarters and also as a dance hall. So through its social gatherings, La Fraternité hoped to introduce young, ideally single, immigrant men and women in an effort to promote Sephardi immigrant marriages, an indication that preserving Ottoman Jewish culture was a priority for this younger generation of immigrants as well. For them too, interestingly, local ties endured, with Renee Ben Bassat, an immigrant and fraternity member, recalling in a 2014 interview, quote, "We made sure couples were from the same cities." And you can see Renee here in this slide. I don't know if you can see my cursor. He is the man on your left, the second from the left. Interestingly, his family came from Bulgaria, and he married Esther Habib, who is on his left, the third from the left. Her family was from Istanbul. So he didn't follow his own rules, but they sort of crossed that local divide. But I should note that apart from youth or associations, and perhaps a few women who worked as waitresses, cafes were very much masculine spaces. And while men forged connections and preserved traditions in brasseries and restaurants, women, and by extension their children, did so in apartments, in the home. In post-war testimonies, the children of Ottoman Sephardi immigrants remember their mothers as really the chiefs of the domestic realm, who transformed these cramped Parisian 1- and 2-bedroom flats into sort of Levantine palaces in their memories. For Joe Amiel, the domestic role that his mother took on was something really to be elevated. He exclaimed, quote, "Oh, the marvelous mothers, the mothers of Rue Sedan. You don't see them anymore. It was another time, another world. It was a social phenomenon, another status of women." Through food, Sephardi immigrant women brought the culinary elements of Ottoman Jewish life into the home and transferred it to their Parisian raised or born children. Food, according to Ottoman immigrants who were children during the interwar years, was what really distinguished their own families from those of non-Sephardi friends. Explains Odette Veron, quote, "My mother made Turkish food, borekas, travados, all sorts of plates. She didn't know how to cook without oil and tomatoes." For Or Rekanati's mother, the kitchen was not only a space of cultural preservation for immigrant women, but also one of gendered socialization. She frequently had Sephardi women friends over for pastries and Turkish coffee. And although children were excluded from the kitchen during such gatherings, Rekanati recalls hearing the women converse exclusively in Ladino, evidence that her mother, in her words, remained very Salonican. As the masters of the domestic sphere, women were also largely responsible for the preservation of the ancestral Sephardi tongue, Ladino. However, whereas Sephardi food was openly celebrated and deliberately shared with the second generation of Ottoman Sephardi immigrants, the Ladino language was not, and was treated instead as a vestige of a past life that shouldn't be carried into the future. For interwar Paris's community, the predominant language of public life was French. And in part, this was because the majority of the Ottoman Sephardi immigrant group, arrived in France proficient in the French language, and therefore had no need to resort to Ladino to communicate with their co-religionists. They could simply use French. But the removal of Ladino from public life was also a means of furthering their integration into French and French Jewish society by avoiding sort of public displays of qualities that marked them as different, and embracing those that underscored belonging and Frenchness. And this is something that sort of highlights a tension, right, between this desire to reject Ladino as a marker of Ottomanness and the seemingly unreserved tendency to flaunt one's Ottoman roots in businesses and cafes and restaurants. Albert Barbout's parents, who were two rare Turkish Jews who didn't speak French fluently, spoke Ladino at home, but refused to speak at all whatsoever in public for fear of being heard or overheard conversing in a foreign language. And frequently parents would speak to their children in French, but to fellow Ottoman Sephardi adults in Ladino, hoping that their children wouldn't understand what they were saying. But their attempts to use Ladino as a secret language by the older generation happened so frequently that parents really undermined their own efforts to be elusive, and their children ended up picking up words and phrases. As a result, many Ottoman Sephardi immigrant children grew up understanding Ladino, but unable to speak it themselves. And finally, Sephardi immigrant women also played crucial roles in the planning of marriages and in matchmaking. And they brought their role in this sort of perpetuation of Sephardi lineage beyond the domestic realm to another gendered space, the neighborhood mikveh. And every Thursday at the ritual baths, Ottoman Sephardi women gathered and exchanged stories and plotted marital arrangements between sons and daughters. So much as the cafes were places where men exchanged details about businesses and communal politics, the mikveh were a space where women shared information about the community and its future. And so dependable was mikveh gossip that it earned the moniker Radio Voltaire and would be reliably recounted to the rest of their family at the dinner table that evening. So for the primarily working class Ottoman Sephardi immigrant majority who settled in the Roquette Quarter, daily life, it was challenging. It involved hardships that contrasted with romantic promises of France as an abundant Jewish paradise that had been repeated by their teachers at Alliance schools in the Levant and that had really fallen into a sort of status as Sephardi lore about the West. But even if the city wasn't a proverbial land of milk and honey, Ottoman Sephardi immigrants were able to carve out a niche that was distinctly their own in interwar Paris. And the 11th Arrondissement became a veritable microcosm of Jewish life in the Ottoman lands. Albert Barbouth, an immigrant, described it as the Orient transposed into Paris. And there, Ottoman Sephardi culture radiated out of spice shops and textile shops, apartment buildings, and most notably, cafés. So establishments like Le Bosphore, they served as watering holes, which was their intention, yes, but within their walls, immigrant information networks and employment opportunities, gendered dynamics, and associational life also brewed. I have a couple more minutes of my initially planned talk, but my clock is telling me that I have gone over. How is everyone feeling?
I think you're fine, Robin.
Okay.
I don't think you're over time. So if you want a few more minutes, I think you should take it.
I've got one more slide, which sort of takes us into the Second World War a little bit, which I think is important for understanding carryover.
And someone else says they would like to learn more about Albert Barbouth. So.
Oh, great. Read my book if I ever get it out. All right. So as I've shown up to this point today, Ottoman characteristics and connections informed interwar daily lives. But Ottoman practices and ties also shaped experiences of persecution and survival during the Second World War and the Holocaust. And I'd like to finish by sort of briefly bringing us into this next darker period of French Jewish history. So for a bit of context, under German occupation, especially in its earlier years, foreign-born Jews were persecuted and deported at much higher rates than were French-born Jews. During this period, Ottoman Sephardi immigrants found themselves in a sort of liminal space, not quite French, not quite foreign, or not as foreign as other foreign groups. And they were treated with a harshness that was somewhat lighter than that extended to Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews, yet certainly heavier than that faced by French Jews in the earlier years of the war. And in ways that were at different times and in different ways life-saving or perilous, the Ottomanness of Ottoman Sephardi Jews played a role in the community's persecution, rescue, and survival. While some individuals were spared from being forced to wear a Jewish star because of Turkish papers, or were repatriated to Spain or other neutral countries thanks to Ottoman-era legal ties. We have the example of Victoria Franco in the left image of this slide, who was repatriated to Spain. Others were deported in roundups that specifically targeted Greek Jews. And I have an example of an arrest list from individuals arrested during the so-called Roundup of the Greeks in 1942. Or they were refused assistance from the Turkish embassy because they hadn't fought for the Ottomans in World War I, or had failed to maintain sort of vague and difficult to navigate registration requirements with the Turkish consulate in Paris after emigration. And by the end of the war, the persecution of Ottoman Sephardi Jews would touch some of the most important spaces of interwar belonging, spaces that I've highlighted today, including Le Bosphore, which remained an important community hub, a place of work, a site of knowledge exchange during the occupation. On the morning of May 5th, 1944, 3 months before the liberation of Paris, a police confidant told Jacques Cohen, the very same man who you saw peddling textiles in that earlier image, that there would be a roundup at Le Bosphore that evening. And Cohen passed the information that he had received from the police officer along to his friends. He told his family, but told his wife that ultimately they decided that they would still go to Le Bosphore. They needed to in order to acquire much needed income for that day, but they would leave before the afternoon and believe that they would be safe if they stuck to that plan. However, the information that Cohen had received was incorrect. And instead of occurring in the evening, the roundup took place at 11 o'clock when the cafe was particularly busy. French and German authorities arrested everyone inside Le Bosphore, including Jacques, as well as dozens of other Ottoman Jewish immigrants, sending them to Drancy, the transit camp outside of Paris in the suburbs. And from there, 93 Ottoman-born Jews were sent to Lithuania, where they were shot on the spot. The rest were deported 5 days later to Auschwitz. And very few Ottoman Jews who were deported survived. One woman named Vida Salmona did make it out of Auschwitz and returned to Paris. When her husband Aron, who had himself survived, also one of the few survivors, learned that his wife was alive and would be returning home via Lyon, he waited for her at the train station every day for 2 weeks. But as fate would have it, on the day that Vida arrived in Paris, Aron had been delayed just ever so slightly. Instinctively, seeing no one at the platform, Vida decided to walk to the 11th Arrondissement, where she found her friends who, helped clean her up, gave her a bath, fresh clothes, some makeup, and told her that her husband was alive, and took her to Le Bosphore. And while Le Bosphore had been the site of her arrest, it also remained the heart of Paris's Ottoman Sephardi immigrant community after the war. And it was there in 1945 that Vida, Aron, and their daughter Giselle were all reunited. So it's sort of both sides. But that is the end of the talk. So I'll leave us there, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Let me remember how to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Robin. We have a couple of questions already in the chat. Please feel free to put questions in the chat to anyone who has them. So someone says there's a synagogue right in the Place des Vosges, and they wondered if this has any connection since it's near the 11th arrondissement, during this period. If you're familiar with it.
Yeah, someone knows Paris. So I believe that is actually, and perhaps Ethan, you know this, but I believe that is a North African synagogue now, and that it was sort of created as a synagogue after the war, but I could be incorrect. That definitely isn't one that is affiliated with this particular Sephardi community. The Temple Popincourt is at number 11 Rue Popincourt, which is like a really tiny mews in between two bigger streets. And it is still there as well, although it sort of functions more as a community center these days. Sometimes there will be sort of group bar bat mitzvahs, but it isn't a place of services anymore.
Okay, lots of questions coming here into the chat. one, one is considering the ongoing persecution or isolation of Jews even before World War II. How were these sources preserved, right? Where did you find your sources? Always a question that historians like.
Always a fun question. I love this question. Yes, so at the time when I met Ethan, probably was really just sort of wandering in the dark, thinking, how am I going to find sources about this community? No one has written about this community, probably because there aren't any sources. But there are. And I started at the CDJC, the Centre de Documentation Juive Contemporaine, where Ethan and I encountered each other, and they had just been given a deposit of 68 testimonies that were collected by a man named Alain de Toledo, who runs an organization called Los Muestros Desaparecidos, which in Ladino means our disappeared ones. And he and his colleagues conducted these interviews between 2012, when they sort of started to realize that this generation whose story hadn't been told, and who at that time were children during the war. These weren't the documents of people who were most adults for the most part, but he collected their testimonies. And so I was able to access and sort of be the first person to use these really valuable testimonies. And it also happened, there was a lot of serendipity happening at the CDJC at this time, that there was a memorial for the roundup of the Greeks, the 1942 roundup. This was 2017, November 2017, that I was there. And it was I guess that would be 75 years, right? It was the 75-year anniversary of the roundup of the Greeks, and there were a number of families there. And so I then was introduced to all these families who, some of them were themselves individual survivors, or if they themselves weren't, their parents were. And I just sort of built this network, and people were immensely generous to me as a non descendant of Ottoman Sephardi Jews, inviting me into their homes and sharing with me their family papers. So that was sort of where I got started. And then from there, I was introduced to one community member who had done a lot of work with preserving sort of associational documents and that sort of material. Some archives did have periodicals that were produced by the community. Those were really valuable. And then the other immensely valuable resources, if anyone studies anything to do with France, go there. It was the Paris Police Archives, because they possess not only mountains of naturalization papers, which are really useful for anyone studying immigrants, but also at the time, any official association had to register with their local police prefecture. So any group, the La Fraternité or any of these groups that I was interested in learning more about had to register with the 11th Arrondissement Prefecture of Police. And the police, at the time, very sort of Stalinistically suspicious of everyone, especially immigrants. Immigrants from the East at that, they were keeping elaborate records of individuals. So there would be paragraphs upon paragraphs of just a regular person, living his life with his family in Paris. But the police would have kept paragraphs of notes, the exact date of his daughter's birth and which hospital. And I was able to make a database from that. So that might have been more than you wanted, but I love talking about sources. So.
Great, that's fascinating. So we have lots of questions. I'm gonna maybe group a couple. The last question came from Luca Zislin, who wanted you to know that it was they had interviewed you last year for URAP.
I remember you, Luca. Thanks for coming.
Just to say hi. So another question was about the importance of the cafes for immigrants and Jewish refugees. This person says between 1933 and 1945. I mean, obviously, they're meaning during the Shoah. I'm going to group that with another question, two other questions related to World War II. One was there a segment of the Sephardic community that escaped persecution during the war? And then more specifically about whether there was like a group focused on escape within the community. And then finally, someone has a question here about Turkey being asked to take any Turkish Jews back by Germany and declining. There's a question that someone heard that this is what happened and they wondered if that is true.
Great questions. Okay, I'll go in order. So in terms of Cafés' importance, so World War II in France, sort of depending on where you start it, began 1939, 1940. So I'll sort of, because the Cafés really served the function that I talked about for most of today's lecture up until that point, even after Hitler's rise to power in neighboring Germany. But during the war, the Cafés did retain importance. They were sort of places where people knew that they could get information about neighborhood roundups, which wasn't always false, as it was in the case of Jacques Cohen and the roundup at Le Bosphore. People were increasingly unable to work the jobs that they had worked before the German invasion of France and the implementation of anti-Jewish laws. And so under the table work for the community became that much more urgently crucial. And some families who owned Cafés, because these Cafés were typically owned and operated by Ottoman Sephardi immigrant families themselves, began sort of offering people meals on credit for families that were increasingly destitute. And the family who owned one particular Café, Chez Bucco, they after the war just had accumulated like all of this credit that of course was never paid back, and they sort of talk about remembering that, but they also used that family, which was René Ben Bassat's family, who was the member of the fraternity that I showed in the photo. They hid in their family-owned restaurant when the French gendarmes were doing a roundup in their neighborhood and coming to their apartment. The Café was just down the street, so they and several groups of neighbors actually hid in the restaurant. But because the police, and this is where the police files come in handy, knew that this family owned this restaurant, the police then went to the restaurant and arrested René's father there. So the Cafés still very much figured in people's lives during the war. As for Sephardim who escaped persecution, great question. This is the last chapter of my book and I'm working on it now. So I don't have all of the numbers laid out, but I do have anecdotal evidence for you. So yes, groups were able to escape persecution, especially if they had legal papers tying them to other countries. So Ottoman Jews often had inherited sort of papers that gave them nebulous connections to Western governments, not necessarily citizenship papers, although sometimes that was the case, but frequently protege papers. So they were proteges or protected subjects of Spain or of Argentina or Italy or another country. And these documents were heritable over the course of generations in the Ottoman Empire. They existed for economic reasons because Western countries wanted access to the mercantile networks of the Ottoman Empire in general. And families, if they still had these papers, were in some cases able to get rescued by the consulates of those countries. So the slide that I had up just before, maybe I can share my screen again, actually. Right here on the left, you see this paper from Victoria Franco, and on the bottom there's a stamp and it says protegido, right? Protected in Spanish. And she was one of 40 families. It was more like 200 individuals who were rescued by the Spanish consulate, Bernardo Roland de Miota. And he defied Franco's, the leader of Spain, Franco's orders to do this and was then recalled back to Madrid, but he managed to rescue almost 200 Ottoman Sephardim from France. The Joint Distribution Committee was able to rescue some through the port of Lisbon. And I'm trying to figure out where they went after that right now. And this connects with the third question about Turkey. Turkey did rescue some Jews Jewish subjects, but Turkey had implemented a rule in 1923 that anyone who emigrated had to register with the consulate in their new place of residence within 5 years, and had to continue to do that every 5 years, or they would lose their citizenship. And these people would not be notified that they lost their citizenship. And many of the Turkish-born Jews in France didn't realize that they had lost their citizenship until they really needed it. And in some cases, depending on the consular agent, they would sort of look the other way and repatriate them to Turkey. It was definitely fewer than 100 individuals though. And in most cases, they were told that they couldn't do anything. And Corey Gutstadt has a really good book about that phenomenon. I'd highly recommend it. She shows that it is really tied to the anti-Semitism of the early Turkish Republic.
Great, thank you. Too many questions now for us to fit them all in our last.
I'll try and be more concise.
No. It's a sign of a great talk and a lot of excitement about it. So my student Danny Solomon is wondering if you have anything to say about the Ottomanness of figures like Albert Cohen or Roger Herrera. He also wanted to alert you to a new article by Alan Toledo in K, the European Jewish Review. But yeah, do you have any answer to that question?
Yeah, so Alan de Toledo is Alan de Toledo, the person that I met at the CDJC. So worlds are colliding. Yeah, so there were a number of, we can sort of think of, there's sort of like the Edgar Morin's, his father was a member of this community, and Albert Cohen, I assume you mean the writer, Albert Cohen. Yeah, there are individuals who weren't particularly involved with this community and who were more involved with, sort of French literary society or artistic society, and Albert Cohen is one of those individuals. Perhaps this is terrible to admit. I don't know who Roger Herrera is. Please, I would love to know. If you could send me an email, that would be very appreciated. Yes, and I shouldn't be perhaps so generalizing about this being the case of the entire community, because some individuals didn't really socialize with or live within the bounds of this community. They were a minority, and usually people who really succeeded in another realm, and that became their world. And I think Albert Cohen is an example of that.
Mm-hmm. I had a question actually about what you told us about the mikveh, which I thought was fascinating. And what I'm wondering is whether or not you see that as, do you know whether that happened at mikvahs in the Ottoman lands for these women or their mothers when they grew up there? Or it sounds almost like the mikveh became like the bathhouse would have been in those places, since Paris didn't have nearly the same kind of scene at public bathhouses. But I wondered if you had something to say about that.
It totally did. And they would colloquially refer to this very small mikveh, sort of, I don't know, it wasn't a building in and of itself, but alcove, as les bains de vapeur, right? The vapor baths. So that was the common term for them. There weren't really vapor baths there, but yes, there is absolutely a connection. I haven't found evidence other than hunches that this is a carryover of life from the Ottoman lands, and in part that's because it's been really difficult. This goes back to the sources question.
Right.
Really difficult to find material that speaks to the lived experiences of women during this time. So my the work I've done on women of this community, it's largely sourced in testimonies from their children or in memoirs. The associations were typically run by men. However, the police did judiciously document as many details about their wives and daughters as they could, so I can get material there. Or if an Ottoman Sephardi woman married a French-born citizen and then naturalized that way, I've been able to find information about them there. But sort of the like everyday experiences of women in this community is just such a obscured history. It's really hard to figure that out. If anyone, again, always looking to learn from others, if anyone has found this in their research and has figured out a way to find these, information about these sort of hard to get histories, I'd love your tips.
Just one more question, which was someone wondered if you had any articles you could recommend about Boot. I think they have a family connection to him. They were looking for any information.
Yeah, I can send, if you send me an email, I can send you the testimony that I have. It is spelt differently, but we all know that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not related whatsoever. So yes, send me an email and I can send you the translated testimony.
Great. Can you put your email address in the chat?
Yes.
Okay, you're now going to be flooded with questions.
No problem.
Thank you so much, Robin. This is a wonderful lecture, and like I said, having so many questions is a reflection of the great interest of this topic. So thank you so much for sharing from your
Thank you so much, Ethan, and thank you to the Center for Jewish Studies and to everyone for coming and for your wonderful questions. I really appreciate it. This has been great.
And we're all looking forward to the book.
Yeah, me too.
All right, take care, everyone.
All right, everyone, have a great Thursday.